ప్రేమ స్వరూపులారా, విద్యార్థులారా, who am I.
Om Shri Sai Ram and welcome to InSAIde Scoop, a podcast that brings you practical servings of Swami's sweetest teachings. Joining us today are an amazing power couple from Philippines. We have Brother Karan, who is a graphic designer and an active Sai young adult, and we have Sister Dimple, who is also a graphic designer and is currently the National Young Adult Coordinator of Philippines. Welcome, dear Brother Karan and Sister Dimple. I'm so happy to have both of you joining us on our podcast today.
Thank you, Sister Pia. Hi everyone, Sairam. I'm Dimple, and looking forward to this conversation.
Sairam, this is Karan, and looking forward to being in this conversation as well.
Lovely. So thank you both for joining us. Our topic for today is, are expectations the enemy? And I want to commence our podcast today with the words of the English poet Alexander Pope, who wrote that, "Blessed is he who expects nothing, for he shall never be disappointed." Many, if not most of us, are familiar with this sort of age-old wisdom that if one wishes to mitigate the potential of disappointment, then one ought to reduce their expectations. But despite knowing this age-old wisdom, many, if not most of us, still find ourselves enmeshed within a myriad of expectations. If we are young adults who are studying, we may have particular expectations related to our academic performance. If we are working adults, we may have expectations revolving around our remuneration, or we may have expectations on the nature of our work, or our company culture, or our career progression within an organization. And irrespective of whatever stage of life we're in, whether we're young adults who are studying or we're working adults, we have all found ourselves having expectations from people, whether that is our parents or our children, our partners, our spouses, our bosses, our colleagues, our friends, or even our relatives. Or if not anyone else, we may have even found ourselves having expectations from our own selves. And more often than not, many of these expectations are failed rather than fulfilled. So I wanted to begin today's discussion by first exploring what are the problems associated with having expectations. Are expectations the real enemy over here?
I don't think it is our enemy. It's not wrong to keep expectations. The point here is to know how to keep realistic expectations. Setting high expectations from yourself and from people can lead to stress.
Thank you so much, Dimple. That's a crucial point, that having expectations is in itself not wrong, but having excessively high and perhaps inflexible expectations could lead to inviting unnecessary stress. Brother Karan, what about you? What do you think are the problems associated with having expectations? And do you believe that expectations are the real enemy?
I feel this is a very, very good question. I don't think expectations per se are the enemy. Enemy is a very strong word, because in the end of the day, all of us are human beings, and we have it's human nature to have expectations. It is how we grew up. It is in us, in our system. So I only think the problem here lies in the gravity of the expectation that we keep or we have, and so if we can balance that out, then I think there is no problem there. Having a small amount of expectations should be okay. But when these expectations become bigger and bigger and bigger, then we have a problem, I believe.
Yeah, thank you both for raising those important perspectives. You know, as both of you were speaking, I was reminded of the words of Brandon Sanderson, the American author, who wrote that expectations were like fine pottery. The harder you held them, the more likely they were to crack. And so expectations are not really the enemy over here. I think having expectations is not inherently problematic, but it is holding on too tightly to those expectations that can be ultimately detrimental. We need to hold expectations in perhaps the same way one holds fine pottery. If we hold on too hard to that fine pottery, we will end up shattering it, and that will ultimately lead to disappointment, hurt, and stress. But can both of you perhaps share a personal experience where you did have expectations and the situation did not transpire accordingly? And then how did you manage that situation? Dimple, perhaps you can take this one first.
So I can tell you an incident about people's expectation towards me. Like at the workplace, I have a project manager, and she keeps track of course, of all of my projects. And I feel like in a day she expects me to deliver this, like 10 posters, for example. And as graphic designers, I mean, you need time to think of a concept. You can't just make something, right? But one thing I did wrong was just to accept. I did not communicate well. I did not tell her how I felt about it. I think my key learning here is that to manage people's expectation well, I should have said no when I'm feeling burned out. I should have communicated well on how I think the deadlines would not meet. I should have been more honest to her.
Yeah, I think, Dimple, that's a really relatable incident, because sometimes communicating our expectations to our seniors or superiors or people who we place on a pedestal can be very difficult. Setting those boundaries can be a lot more challenging than it seems. In such situations, then, how do we navigate managing people's expectations from us? What would you recommend as some practical tips that we can undertake?
Like I mentioned earlier, I think communication is super important here. We tend to just say okay to everything, say yes, I'm gonna do it, but you have to give yourself a break. You cannot just accept everything. You accept everything and the work does not even get done. You can't give 100% to everything. So it's okay. We have to, if there's a change of situation, that's fine, that's healthy. We have to communicate. We are allowed to say no once in a while. We shouldn't give ourselves a hard time.
Right, yeah. I think perhaps that's something that a lot of us have difficulty in accepting, that it's okay to say no. I think from a very young age, we've just always been taught to please others, and this people-pleasing behavior sometimes translates in a difficulty of articulating no, but maybe it's just the awareness that it's all right to set your own boundaries, it's all right to say no, and sometimes just saying no can be adequate to manage the expectations of others. So yeah, that was really helpful. Karan, what about you? Any incidents where you had expectations from friends, or friends had expectations from you, and how did you manage that?
Yeah. So with friends, you do have expectations, because in the end of the day, if you've been friends from a long time, then expectations kind of just form from each other, maybe even not just one-sided. And so I did have a friend once back in the day, Rahul, and we were good friends for a few years. And he had a wedding, and I wasn't invited. Very petty, to be honest. And so then comes the whole the drill, where you keep thinking in your mind that, wait, Rahul's getting married. How come he didn't invite me? But this person's invited, and that person's invited, and everyone's invited. All my friends are invited, but he didn't invite me. What did I do? Did I do something wrong? And there's this whole events happening in your brain where you're just articulating like nonsense, because in the end of the day, I mean, the expectation you had from Rahul has nothing to do with your friendship, to be honest. I mean, it's okay. You just have to let go and just accept that it's not everything that you want in the world is what's going to happen. And so I think for me, that was one of the incidents in the past that kind of got to me.
Right. I think this idea of letting go and minimizing our expectations in situations where we cannot control it is such a realistic thing to do. But that again, contrasts against what Dimple was talking about earlier about communicating our expectations. So, what are some general guidelines on when is it a good idea to minimize our expectations versus when is it appropriate to have expectations and communicate our expectations so that we can then manage the expectations of others? Dimple, do you want to go first with this one?
Yeah. So I do think that expectations provide both clarity and disappointment. We can't really say that keeping expectation is right or wrong. Again, here the point is to know how to keep realistic expectations.
I feel that we can minimize expectations if it's from others. In the end of the day, keeping expectations from other people is just unhealthy. It is because there was a quote once, I'm not sure who said it, but a friend of mine told me this quote, and it was something like, if you can't understand your own mind, imagine how more so if you can understand someone else's mind. So I mean to say that in the end of the day, just not having expectations from others is just helpful to your own sanity. I think having expectations with yourself is okay. In the end of the day, that may just make you better. It make you improve your personal self. Again, not unrealistic expectations, realistic expectations to yourself
And
also.
also we need to learn how to accept situations that we cannot control. I mean, if you had a goal or if you had a vision and things don't work out, it's okay, just move on.
Right, right. I want to pick up on something that Karan you said about minimizing our expectations and how when we're having expectations with others, it's a good idea to keep our expectations as low as possible. Is lowering our expectations the same as lowering our standards? Because we're often encouraged to have certain standards in our relationships, in our friendships. We're encouraged to have certain standards in the work that we do. And so, is it possible then to maintain standards while keeping expectations low?
So I think that it is possible. It is not easy, of course, because having standards is what makes you have an expectation. Also, having a standard of friendship is what makes you have an expectation from that friendship. So it is not easy, but I think with the practice or with failed attempts of having expectations and not meeting them, one realizes that it is possible to just keep the same. I mean, at least you have to make yourself understand that I can keep the same standard, but not have as many expectations, because if they're not met, then I'm just not helping myself. And if I make my standards lower of my friendship or on my workplace, that's also not good for the community, for myself, and for everything around me.
Right, right. I want to pick up on something that Dimple brought up earlier, the point on needing to accept and learning to let go. While practicing that can be very difficult, and many of us do struggle with it, there are also many of us who accept too much. We accept situations that perhaps compromise our standards, and we adopt this let go attitude towards everything to the point that it becomes detrimental. And so, at what point does one need to stop accepting and stop letting go in order to ensure that our standards are not compromised? When do we know that certain expectations that we have are important for us to be fulfilled and they're not being fulfilled, and that if we continue to accept status quo, it will no longer be appropriate for us? How do we know when is it important for us to communicate what our expectations are, and communicate that if these expectations continue to be left unfulfilled, we need to then enforce certain standards? So, for example, in the case of friendships or relationships, it's the time for us to walk out of that friendship or relationship. Or in the workplace, it's time for us to leave that job. What are some guidelines that you might recommend?
Yeah, so I feel like having expectations, again, it's a normal feeling. But in the end of the day, if you have very high expectations, it's going to harm you. But there is an amount of expectation you can have from someone else if you are doing the work also, or if you are giving back. And if that is not being met, if you're not being appreciated for the work that you are doing, or for the friendship or the standard that you hold, then in the end of the day, if there's no appreciation, then it's time to go. I mean, it's very personal. I think each and every person will know when the time comes. Yeah.
Right, right. So, assuming now we're in a situation where we have had these high expectations and those expectations have failed us, and now, we're coping with emotions of disappointment or, in certain cases, anger, hurt, or even grief. What are some practical tips that you might suggest to cope with those emotions?
Go to bed. I'm kidding. After you go to bed, I think that you have to just understand that okay, I had these expectations and they were not met, and then try to understand why they were not met. And once you understand the process of what just happened in your system, with those feelings that you had, then I think with due process you will understand that lowering your expectations the next time would make it more comfortable, everything around you. And it's a learning process, I feel. It doesn't happen overnight, but You just have to keep at it. Yeah.
Right, right. And Dimple, any practical tips from you?
I think calm down, close your eyes, review everything. Did you do something wrong? Just kind of yeah, see how everything went through, learn from your mistakes, understand what just happened, like what Karan said. And again, for me, it's just really acceptance. Once you accept it, you move on. The next time you're in that scenario again, you already know that, okay, no, I expected too much before. Now it's just, it's not like I'm lowering my standard, but I'm kind of like anticipating the worst case scenario already so that I don't get disappointed.
Right. Dimple, I want to also pick up on what you said on acceptance, because I think that is the key word over here whenever we're like dealing with these difficult emotions. Sometimes we're aware that we need to accept, but still it feels very difficult to accept. So how exactly can we do that? How can we accept when we want to accept, but we're struggling to accept?
So I think if you don't know how to accept expectations, or the outcomes of expectations, because of course you will feel anger and hurt and all of that. I believe personally that meditation is a very good output. If you sit quietly, concentrate on your breath for a few minutes, you will feel this calmness. You will have more clarity, and I think that clarity will make things more easy for you to understand why you felt like that and how to avoid this feeling in the future.
Yeah, I've actually learned this from Karan's mom. Whenever she gets disappointed and she can't change the situation anymore, I see her just sitting in the mandir, praying, and just being with God, being with Swami, being with Baba. And yeah, it calms her mind, and I should learn from that. Yeah.
Wonderful, Dimple. I think that's a beautiful note for us to end our discussion on for today, that if we are confronted with failed expectations and we are struggling to accept the outcome of a particular situation, we may find solace in strengthening our sadhana, in augmenting our faith, in trusting that everything is happening in accordance to Swami's divine will. And like you said, Karan, we can reach that space of inner clarity through calming our mind through meditation. Dear listeners, it is now time for some prasadam pills. 1. Expectations are not the enemy. Having expectations are perfectly normal, but it is holding on too tightly and being too attached to the outcome of expectations that may result in potential disappointment, stress, and hurt. 2. In order to manage the expectations of others, we need to learn to clearly communicate our expectations. Sometimes this may entail saying no when necessary, and doing so will help us avoid burnout and feeling overwhelmed. 3. When people do not meet our expectations, rather than holding on to grudges and developing resentment, we need to learn that their thoughts, words, and actions are beyond our locus of control, and we need to accept the situation in order to let go of our tightly held expectations. 4. When we are struggling to accept a situation, we need to introspect to gain deeper clarity. Some practical strategies that we may adopt include meditation and strengthening our sadhana in order to calm our minds and find peace in knowing that our Swami always has our lives under control. Next, on InSAIde Scoop, we'll be addressing the question of, can I be both loving and tough? Until next Friday, happy scooping!